Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The second hands did not stop so much as lean back, as if taking a breath with the rest of Millhaven. In the small bedroom where Clara labored, the lamp on the dresser hummed softly and cast an amber glow over the folded towels, the porcelain bowl of warm water, and the worn quilt that had welcomed 3 generations of babies into the world. The open window let in the scent of wet leaves and the promise of rain that never quite arrived, while somewhere in the distance a train's whistle held its note a heartbeat longer than usual, as if even the locomotives understood that something tender was unfolding. Evan paced his familiar 3 steps to the window and back again, his hands still carrying sawdust under the nails from the rocking chair he'd been sanding in the workshop. He'd meant to finish it before the baby came, to have everything perfect and ready. Now the half-completed chair waited in the next room like a held breath, its smooth curves promising countless nights of gentle rocking. Mrs. Holloway, who had delivered more babies in Millhaven than anyone could count, touched his elbow with the kind of pressure that felt like the word hush made tangible. "Listen," she murmured, and to his surprise Evan found that the house was listening too. In that extraordinary pause, all the small noises that people carry without noticing fell quiet. The old mantel clock that had ticked through birthdays and thunderstorms held its breath mid-tick. The kettle on the stove, left simmering for tea that no one remembered to pour, went still before its whistle could sound. Down the street, Mrs. Patterson's collie raised its head from its paws, decided nothing was wrong, and settled back into the kind of deep, peaceful sleep that dogs know better than humans. Even Clara's face smoothed between contractions, the effort ebbing just enough to let a small, wondering smile slip across her features, one she would later claim she didn't remember, though Evan would carry the image of it for the rest of his life. Mrs. Holloway had attended births in rooms that smelled of soap and hope, in farmhouses where the wind rattled the windows, and in apartments where the walls were thin, and the neighbors held their breath along with the laboring mothers. She understood the difference between fear and reverence, and what filled this room was pure reverence. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, rich, like a blanket laid over tired shoulders, or the moment just before dawn when the world holds all its colors close. "There now," she whispered, not to anyone in particular, her voice fitting the room the way rain fits a river. "All things come when they're ready." When the time came, it arrived like a tide choosing its shore, inevitable but gentle, powerful but unhurried. The pressure gathered and rose, then softened as Iris slipped into the world without the sharp insistence of a cry. Instead, she offered a sigh so natural and complete, it made sense of everything that had come before. Her first breath sounded like the end of a lullaby, the part where someone sings the last note under their breath because the baby has finally fallen asleep. It was a sound that seemed to carry echoes of ancient comfort, of mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers who had sung children into peace across countless generations. Evan went very still, his fingertips halfway to his mouth, as if he were afraid to disturb something delicate and sacred. Clara reached out her trembling hands, and the room seemed to step closer, the walls themselves leaning in to witness. Iris was warm and impossibly small, and yet her presence expanded the space, the way dawn expands a room before you open the curtains. Her eyes opened almost at once, not with the unfocused, startled gaze of most newborns, but with something steady there, something that didn't need names or explanations, only recognition. Mrs. Holloway wrapped her in the soft yellow blanket that Clara's mother had knitted, each stitch a prayer for safety and love. As she did, she found herself humming a lullaby she hadn't thought of in decades, something her own grandmother had sung during thunderstorms, when the world outside seemed too big and frightening for small hearts to bear. The melody hung in the air longer than it should have, each note lingering like the last light of sunset, creating a cocoon of sound that made everyone in the room feel held and safe, and deeply, inexplicably loved. "Some children," Mrs. Holloway said quietly, adjusting the blanket around Iris's tiny form, "are born carrying pieces of peace in their pockets." The words came from somewhere deeper than her conscious mind, from a place where wisdom lives before it becomes language. She laid Iris on Clara's chest, and as their skin touched, something extraordinary happened. The warmth that radiated from the baby wasn't just body heat, it was something more profound, a gentle energy that seemed to soften every sharp edge in the room. Every worry, every fear, Clara felt it first, a loosening in her chest that had nothing to do with the physical relief of birth. It was as if her daughter's presence was already beginning to rearrange the world around them, not through force or drama, but through the simple, revolutionary act of existing with complete peace. Evan, leaning over his wife and daughter, felt the knot of anxiety that had lived between his shoulder blades for months, the worry about money and mortgages and whether he'd be a good father, simply dissolve. He found himself breathing deeper than he had in years, his chest expanding with air that tasted somehow cleaner, more nourishing. Then, as if a conductor had tapped a baton none of them could see, the clocks throughout Millhaven cleared their throats and resumed their tick. Not louder, not faster, just aware. The mantel clock's hands moved forward with a courteous nod to the minutes they had let pass. 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Evan glanced at the envelope holding the electric bill and penciled the time in the corner, as if writing it down would help him hold on to this moment a little longer. 3:17 was not a number he would have chosen for anything important, and yet there it was, circling him for years afterward, like a familiar bird that always found his windowsill. Outside, the streetlight at the corner resumed its usual brightness, though if anyone had been awake to notice, they might have sworn it bent toward their house for just a moment, the way sunflowers follow their sun. Throughout the town, small miracles of sleep were unfolding. A neighbor shifting in her bed dreamed of a field with no fences. A young man on the late shift at the mill suddenly remembered the taste of his mother's soup and smiled without knowing why. Children who had fought bedtime fell into the kind of deep restorative sleep that would have their parents marveling in the morning. Clara did not speak. She didn't need to. Her breath made a soft rise and fall beneath the bundle of her daughter, and her eyes were bright with tears that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with recognition. This was not just any baby. This was a child who had arrived carrying something the world desperately needed, something it had perhaps forgotten it was missing. Mrs. Holloway busied herself with the practiced grace of someone who knew that the holy often arrives disguised as ordinary work, straightening sheets and adjusting the lamp with the care of someone tidying around a quiet miracle. As the first hour after birth stretched thin and golden, Iris made that soft sighing sound again, and everyone in the room understood without words that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not a miracle in the dramatic sense, no angels or bright lights or voices from heaven, but something more subtle and perhaps more powerful, the arrival of a soul who remembered what peace felt like and was willing to share that memory with a world that had almost forgotten how to rest. When morning finally climbed the roofs of Millhaven and laid its gentle hands on their window, the house accepted the day with a nod. Birds rehearsed their scales at the eaves. The neighbor's screen door squeaked and shut. And in the small bedroom where time had paused to witness a birth, Iris opened her eyes once more and seemed to look directly at each person in the room, as if she were memorizing their faces, learning the geography of love that would guide her through all the years ahead. Her gaze lingered longest on her parents, and in that moment, Clara and Evan both understood that they hadn't just brought a child into the world. They had welcomed a teacher, a small ambassador of the peace that lives at the heart of all things. Waiting patiently for someone to remember it's there. The town would not know to name it yet, this gentle shift in its rhythm. For now it was enough to know that something tender had taken root, and that even time, for 3 minutes and 17 seconds, had loved it enough to sit down and listen. The days that followed Iris's birth unfolded like pages in a book written in whispers, each morning teaching the house a little more about the rhythm of peace. Clara found herself moving differently through the familiar rooms, her footsteps softer on the old wooden floors, as if the very act of carrying her daughter had taught her body a new language of gentleness. The baby rarely cried, not the absent silence of illness, but the full, rich quiet of someone who had arrived exactly where they belonged. When she did make sounds, they were soft murmurs and sighs that seemed to carry conversations with invisible friends, melodies that made the air itself feel more breathable. Evan discovered this first on a Tuesday morning when he was running late for work, his coffee still too hot to drink, and his mind already racing through the day's tasks at the lumber yard. He paused at the nursery door, drawn by something he couldn't name, and found Iris lying in her crib with her tiny fists uncurled, her dark eyes focused on the mobile of wooden birds that slowly turned above her head. As he watched, she made that sound, the same contented sigh she'd offered the night she was born, and the knot of anxiety in his chest, the one that had been his constant companion since the mortgage payment had increased, simply loosened and fell away like an old coat sliding from tired shoulders. He stood there for 5 minutes. He couldn't afford to spare, breathing deeper than he had in months, and when he finally left for work, he carried something new with him. At the lumberyard, Jim, who operated the big saw and had known Evan since high school, paused in his measuring to study his friend's face. "You look different," he said, tilting his head like a curious bird, calmer, like you found something you didn't know you were looking for. Evan wanted to explain about Iris, about the way she seemed to carry peace like other babies carried blankets, but he found himself without adequate words. Instead, he just smiled and offered to share his sandwich, peanut butter and honey on bread that Clara had baked, cut into triangles because somehow triangles felt more generous than squares. It was Clara who first noticed the daily rhythm that began to establish itself around their daughter. Every afternoon at 3:17, the exact time the clocks had paused for Iris's birth, something in the house would shift. Not dramatically, not visibly, but unmistakably. The clocks did not stop again, but they seemed to soften their ticking, as if keeping time with a gentler heartbeat. That minute wore a hush like a shawl, and if you were in the kitchen, you could hear the settling of flour in its jar, the gentle whisper of dust motes dancing in afternoon light. Sometimes Clara would stop with her hand around the teapot and wonder why her eyes had filled with unexpected tears. She would look down and find Iris watching her with that steady, curious gaze, as if the child had reached into the air and gathered something invisible, something that made room for tears without needing a reason. As autumn painted the world in shades of gold and letting go, Iris's gift began to show its true nature, not as a passive state, but as something she could actively, if unconsciously, employ. When Evan came home from his carpentry workshop, he carried the day's weight in the tightness of his shoulders, the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of careful measurements and stubborn wood. He'd often settle into the rocking chair he'd finished sanding just before her birth, letting out a sigh that felt heavy with the world's expectations. Iris, barely tall enough to reach his knee, would approach with the deliberate grace of a willow branch swaying in a breeze. She wouldn't demand attention or chatter as other children might. Instead, she would simply sit beside him, often placing a tiny hand on his forearm or resting her head against his leg with the trust of someone who had never learned that the world could be anything but safe. In those moments, something remarkable would happen. Evan wouldn't always notice it consciously at first, but the tension would gradually unspool from his muscles, like thread from a careful spindle. The hum of worries in his mind would soften, then fade, replaced by a quiet calm that tasted of home and safety, and bread rising in a warm kitchen. It felt as if Iris was drawing the weariness from him, absorbing it into her small palms like a sponge absorbs water, then releasing it into the air like invisible steam from a cooling teacup. He would eventually open his eyes, feeling a lightness he hadn't known he'd lost, and find Iris looking up at him with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of old souls wrapped in new skin. He didn't understand how she did it, only that she did, and that her presence had become a balm he anticipated with the gentle longing of someone who has discovered that healing can be as simple as sitting quietly together while the afternoon light moves across familiar walls. Clara, too, found her daughter's gift woven into the fabric of their evenings like golden thread through ordinary cloth. Bedtime stories, a cherished ritual, took on an almost magical quality when told in Iris's room. Other children might interrupt with questions or squirm with impatience, but Iris would lie perfectly still, her eyes wide and luminous in the lamplight. As Clara read, the words seemed to hang in the air a moment longer than they should, each syllable resonating with a gentle echo, as if Iris were amplifying the peace between the sentences, creating space where dreams could unfold slowly and safely. The stories didn't just end. They settled like leaves floating onto a still pond. Clara found herself lingering over passages, her voice naturally softening, the rush of the day dissolving into the quiet magic of narrative. Sometimes she would lose her place entirely, caught in the tranquil space Iris had created, only to find the words return to her whispered by the very air in the room. It was in these moments that Clara understood her daughter wasn't just being quiet. She was collecting it, gathering the rich, full silence that holds space for healing, for dreaming, for simply being present in a world that had forgotten the art of stillness. Dr. Matthews, who had delivered more babies than he cared to count, stopped by for Iris's regular checkups and found himself staying longer than necessary. He'd seen healthy babies before, of course, but there was something about Iris that made him want to linger, to sit in that rocking chair and simply observe. She gazed at him with those dark, steady eyes, and he found himself remembering why he'd wanted to become a doctor in the first place, not for the prestige or the income, but for moments like this, when medicine felt less like science and more like bearing witness to small miracles. "She's gathering something," he said to Clara one afternoon, surprising himself with the words. "I don't know what to call it, but she's collecting... quiet, maybe? Peace?" He shook his head, embarrassed by his own lack of medical precision, but Clara nodded as if she understood exactly what he meant. They watched as Iris turned her head toward the window, where a cardinal was teaching its young to sing, and somehow the bird's lesson seemed to last longer than usual, the notes hanging in the air like visible things made of light and hope. The effects began to ripple outward in ways that no one quite understood but everyone could feel. Mrs. Patterson from next door started arriving with casseroles, and staying for tea, settling into the kitchen chair that had always been slightly uncomfortable, but somehow now seemed to fit her perfectly. "There's something different about this house," she said one afternoon, stirring honey into her cup with slow, thoughtful circles. "It feels like when you walk into a library and suddenly remember that you love to read." The postman, Mr. Henley, began lingering at their mailbox, sometimes pausing to listen to something he couldn't quite identify, humming along to melodies that felt familiar in the way that childhood lullabies do, even when you can't remember who first sang them to you. By the time Iris learned to walk, her collecting had grown more deliberate and visible. She would toddle from room to room with a small wicker basket, filling it with what she seemed to consider essentials: a folded napkin, a wooden block, a smooth pebble from Evan's pocket, a cotton ball from the bathroom like a captured cloud. "Are you a quiet kid?" Evan would say, trying not to smile at the seriousness with which she approached her task. Iris would blink solemnly and set the basket down beside whoever looked most tired, as if offering them tools for peace they didn't know they needed. Her older brother Sam had always found night a little too noisy for his thoughts, his mind racing like a hamster on a wheel long after the house had settled into sleep. But after Iris began her midnight wanderings, the soft thump-scrape rhythm of her basket on the floor, the gentle thud of her sitting down outside his door, something changed. She would push the basket toward the line of light beneath his door and wait with the patience of someone who understood that healing couldn't be rushed. When Sam opened the door and found her there, cross-legged in the hallway with a cotton ball in her outstretched palm, he would laugh despite himself, then sit beside her in the threshold while she distributed her small treasures. Those nights the house settled sooner, and Sam's breathing grew even while Iris fell asleep in the hall. The basket tipped like a moon, spilling its gentle light. As winter leaned toward spring and the world began its slow awakening, a letter arrived in handwriting that was at once elegant and a little stubborn, the way script gets when it has lived through many seasons. The envelope smelled faintly of yeast and lilacs, and when Clara pressed it to her nose, something old and warm moved through her like a half-remembered lullaby. She opened it at the kitchen table, while Iris drew slow circles with her finger in a patch of spilled flour, making moons and then wiping them away with the flat of her small hand. The words were simple, the invitation gentler than advice. "When the lilacs open, come by. I've got the kettle on and a loaf in the oven, and I believe that child of yours is carrying a story I want to hear. Love, Grandmother Willow." Clara read it aloud, and Evan nodded from his place at the window, and somewhere inside the house, a door that had been resting on its hinges for years swung a little wider. Iris lifted her flour-dusted hand and patted the envelope, leaving a pale thumbprint where the last sentence sat like a blessing waiting to unfold. That evening, as the day folded itself neatly and slid into night, they traced a little route on the map, with the care of people who have decided to follow a thread as far as it will go. The lilacs were still tight-fisted green knots on bare branches, but spring was coming with its promises of bloom and renewal. Iris fell asleep early, her cheek against Evan's shirt, her palm open as if it held something invisible and precious and safe, ready to be shared with whoever might need a piece of peace handed back to them, clean and warm, like a freshly folded napkin laid beside a plate prepared with love. In the quiet that followed, as the house settled around them and the clocks marked their gentle time, Clara and Evan understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, not a miracle in the dramatic sense, but something more subtle and perhaps more powerful, the daily unfolding of a soul who remembered what the world had forgotten about the art of being peacefully, completely, transformatively present. The lilacs kept their promise on a Tuesday morning that felt wrapped in Sunday's gentle arms, their purple clusters heavy with the kind of fragrance that makes time pause to take a deeper breath. Clara had been checking the tight green buds each morning, like reading a calendar written in petals, and when she woke to find them full-bloomed and nodding in the soft breeze, she felt the same quiet certainty that had guided them through Iris's early months. The air carried that faint, sweet hush that flowers make when they open all at once, and even the birds seemed to sing more softly, as if they understood that something tender was about to unfold. Iris spent the morning gathering with unusual deliberation, her small hands selecting each treasure with the care of someone preparing for ceremony. Into her wicker basket went a button that had fallen from Evan's work shirt during breakfast, still carrying the warmth of his fingers. A dandelion head gone to silver seed found its place beside a smooth stone from the garden path, one that had spent yesterday afternoon collecting sunshine. She added a cotton ball that had somehow escaped the bathroom drawer, soft as a captured cloud, and a wooden block worn smooth by Sam's childhood hands. When she finished, she tied the lilac ribbon Willow had given her around the basket's handle, the purple silk trailing like a gentle signature through the morning light. The drive to Grandmother Willow's house wound through streets that seemed to remember being quieter, where the old houses sat back from the road, like comfortable grandmothers settling into their favorite chairs. Sam rode with them this time, his usual restlessness softened by something he couldn't name, his hands folded quietly in his lap instead of drumming against the window. As they turned onto Maple Street, Iris made that soft sighing sound that had become her signature, and the car itself seemed to settle into a more peaceful rhythm, as if even the engine understood they were approaching something sacred. Willow's house announced itself before the address became visible. The egy scent of bread baking drifted through the open windows and settled over the front garden like a benediction. The porch wrapped around the building like arms offering an embrace, every surface that could hold something soft, doing so with quiet generosity. Quilts draped over the swing, cushions arranged on wicker chairs that looked like they had been waiting for exactly these visitors, and hanging baskets spilling over with plants that seemed to grow not just toward the sun, but toward anyone who might need their particular shade of green comfort. Grandmother. Willow appeared in the doorway before they'd reached the front steps, wiping her hands on an apron that looked like it had witnessed 1,000 meals prepared with love. She was smaller than Clara remembered, her silver hair braided and pinned with the kind of care that suggests both practicality and celebration, her eyes the warm blue of summer afternoons. When she looked at Iris, something passed between them, a recognition that needed no words. Like two people discovering they speak the same rare and beautiful language. "There she is," Willow said, her voice carrying the warmth of ovens and the patience of rising dough, the one who's been collecting quiet. She knelt to Iris's level with the careful grace of someone whose joints had earned their stiffness through decades of kneading and lifting and holding. Iris approached without hesitation, her basket clutched in both small hands, and when she reached Willow, she solemnly lifted out the dandelion seed head. Willow accepted it with the reverence due a state gift, holding it up to catch the light filtering through the porch roof. "4 wishes," she said, and Iris nodded as if this were the most natural conversation in the world. Inside, the kitchen was exactly what every kitchen aspires to be, a room where every surface told stories of meals shared and comfort given freely. The wooden table bore the gentle scars of decades of use, circular marks from hot pots and faint lines where someone had cut vegetables directly on its surface rather than dirty another board. Copper pots hung from hooks like old friends waiting to be useful again, and the windowsill held mason jars, filled with herbs that caught the afternoon light and threw green shadows across the worn linoleum floor. A kettle hummed a note that sounded almost like hello, and the air was thick with the scent of yeast and warmth and something indefinable that might have been love made tangible. Some people, Willow said, settling into the chair that clearly belonged to her, its cushion shaped by years of use, are born knowing things that the rest of us have to learn through years of making mistakes. You, little one, seem to have arrived with your lessons already tucked into your pockets. She watched as Iris began to unpack her basket with ceremonial precision, each item placed on the table with the deliberation of someone arranging an altar. The button beside the salt shaker, the smooth stone next to the sugar bowl, the cotton ball nestled against the honey jar like a small cloud come to rest. Willow observed this careful ceremony with the attention of someone reading a text in a language she was still learning, nodding occasionally, as if certain placements made perfect sense. "Gathering and giving," she murmured when Iris finished, her weathered finger touching the button with gentle recognition. "That's the art, isn't it? Knowing what people need before they know they need it, and having it ready when the moment arrives." Her finger moved to the stone. "This holds yesterday's sunshine, doesn't it? For when today feels too cloudy to bear." Clara found herself leaning forward, drawn into this conversation that felt less like explanation and more like translation. She had watched Iris's collecting for months without understanding its deeper purpose, assuming it was simply the natural hoarding instinct of childhood. But as Willow spoke, patterns began to emerge, connections that had been invisible suddenly becoming clear as morning light through clean windows. "How do you know?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell of understanding that was settling over the kitchen like flour sifting through fine mesh. Willow poured tea that steamed like small prayers rising toward heaven, the cups mismatched, but somehow perfectly suited to their users. "My grandmother taught me, though she learned it from her grandmother," and so on back through the line of women who understood that some gifts skip generations, waiting for the right soul to carry them forward. She handed Clara a cup that was pale blue with tiny roses around the rim, the kind of delicate china that suggests special occasions, but has been loved into everyday use. We called them harbor souls, people born with the ability to create safe spaces where others can rest and heal and remember who they are beneath all the noise. The bread came from the oven golden and singing the soft song that fresh loaves make as they cool. And Willow set it on a rack with the care of someone presenting a gift. From a drawer worn smooth by countless openings, she produced a star-shaped cutter, its metal edges dull with use but still sharp enough for its gentle purpose. "When my hands forget their gentleness," she explained, "I make stars. Bread becomes softer when it remembers it was once a field." She showed Iris how to press the cutter through the warm bread with steady palms, how to twist just a little at the end, so the edges smoothed instead of tearing. "Everything takes a soft twist," Willow said, half to the dough, half to the girl. "Keys, ideas, grief." Iris nodded with the seriousness of someone receiving a secret, placing each star on the cutting board with the care of someone handling small pieces of captured light. The butter came next, pale yellow and soft as summer mornings. 17 strokes, Willow said, her voice low and even as she demonstrated the gentle spreading. Then we paused for 3 breaths. "It's a pattern that suits you." She didn't glance at the small brass clock on the shelf, one with a face that looked like a friendly moon, but somehow they all knew it was approaching that familiar time. She drizzled honey in a thin line that caught the light like a tiny river, then handed the knife to Iris. "Now you spread more than butter." As Iris worked, her small face serious with concentration, something extraordinary began to happen. The honey seemed to hold the light longer. The butter spread with unusual smoothness, and the very air in the kitchen grew softer, more welcoming. Sam, who had been fidgeting in his chair, found himself breathing deeper, the worry that usually hummed behind his forehead dialing its volume down to barely a whisper. Evan felt the knot between his shoulders loosen without his conscious awareness, and Clara discovered that for the first time in weeks, she wasn't mentally cataloguing the tasks waiting at home. At exactly 3:17, the kitchen acknowledged something profound. The brass clock did not stop. It bowed, its hands pausing in a gesture of respect. The steam from the fresh tea thinned and drifted with unusual grace, and the sunlight falling through the window brightened then gentled as if it had tipped its hat to a familiar traveler passing by. In that moment, they all understood that they were witnessing more than a cooking lesson. They were learning the ancient art of folding peace into ordinary things, of making every small act a bridge between one heart and another. "You see," Willow said softly as the moment passed and time resumed its gentle flow, "you're not just making sandwiches. You're creating little pockets of comfort that people can carry with them. Reminders that someone took the time to spread kindness between slices of warm bread." She wrapped half the loaf in a towel and pressed it into Evan's hands, then slipped the star cutter into Clara's pocket without remark. To Iris, she gave a small cloth bag that smelled of lavender and dreams. "For tucking into pillows when sleep feels too far away," she explained. As they prepared to leave, the late afternoon light painting everything in shades of honey and contentment, Willow bent to press her forehead gently against Iris's for a brief, quiet moment. "You don't have to fix everything, little lighthouse," she whispered. "Oh, you only have to be. Being is the bravest thing, and you do it so beautifully." They walked to the car carrying more than they had brought, not just the bread and the star cutter and the lavender, but a deeper understanding of Iris's gift and its purpose. Sam swung the basket for a few steps, then stopped, sensing it wasn't something that liked to be swung. Iris reached for it again, the lilac ribbon trailing its gentle signature through the air, and when they reached their car, even the familiar streetlight seemed to lean slightly in welcome, the way it had on the night she was born. That evening, Clara cut star sandwiches with the practiced twist Willow had taught them, counting 17 strokes of butter and 3 quiet breaths without feeling foolish for the counting. Sam placed the lavender bag on his nightstand and found that it made his room smell like calm even when it didn't smell like anything at all. And Iris, arranging her quiet kit by the front door, added the cloth bag like a medal earned, understanding somehow that her small collection of treasures had become something larger, tools for weaving threads of peace into the fabric of the world. One star-shaped sandwich, one gentle presence, one perfectly gathered moment at a time. Later, as the house settled into its evening rhythm and stories read themselves into the air, Iris hummed Willow's 3-note lullaby and left the last note unfinished, just breath. The house answered with its own settling, its own listening, and somewhere beyond their windows the town breathed with them. Each of them carried a simple knowing to bed. They had learned not just to recognize Iris's gift, but to help it grow, to give it room to expand beyond their walls into a world that desperately needed to remember the healing power of being peacefully, completely transformatively present. The morning after their visit to Grandmother Willow's house arrived with the scent of bread rising and the gentle ritual of star-shaped sandwiches that had woven itself into the fabric of their days. Clara found herself moving through the kitchen with the same deliberate grace Willow had taught them, counting 17 strokes of butter and pausing for 3 quiet breaths without feeling foolish for the counting. Iris arranged her quiet kit with ceremonial care, each treasure finding its place in the small cloth bag that had become her constant companion. The smooth stone still carrying yesterday's sunshine, the cotton ball soft as a captured cloud, the wooden button that held the warmth of home in its simple curves. School arrived the way gentle weather does, changing the light in the morning and the rhythm of breakfast more than anything else. The brick building of Millhaven Elementary sat among old maples that seemed to lean in with curiosity, their branches creating patterns of shadow and welcome across the playground, where children's voices wove themselves into the morning air like familiar songs. Iris approached the building with the same steady calm she brought to everything, her small backpack carrying not just crayons and notebooks, but the invisible weight of all the peaceful moments she had been collecting since birth. Miss Chen met them at the classroom door with the kind of smile that happens when a person's eyes arrive before their words. She had taught young children for more years than she cared to count, and she recognized the usual patterns of first-day anxiety, the clutched hands, the backward glances, the tears that arrived without warning like sudden summer storms. But as Iris entered the cheerful room with its blocks and books and finger paintings drying on easels like captured rainbows, something unprecedented happened. The classroom itself seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for exactly this child to arrive and remind it how to settle into peace. The morning unfolded with an ease that felt almost magical, though Miss Chen was practical enough to know that magic was often just the right person, being present at the right moment with the right kind of attention. During circle time, When the children gathered on the colorful rug for stories and songs, Iris took her place near the window where autumn light scattered itself across the floor like stars that had come to watch. She traced one patch of light with her fingertip and seemed to listen not just to Miss Chen's words, but to something deeper, the rhythm of the room, the emotional weather of 20 small hearts learning to be away from home. It was during outdoor time that Iris's gift first revealed itself to her new community. Tommy, who always ran a little too fast for his feet, took the curve around the slide wrong and ended up on the gravel, his knee blooming red in that alarming way scrapes do. The sharp cry that erupted from him drew a circle of wide-eyed faces, some curious, some sympathetic, some frightened by the raw sound of pain. But before the adult supervisors could reach him, Iris was there. She didn't rush or arrive with dramatic flourish. She moved with the deliberate pace of someone who understood that hurrying often added to the disquiet. She simply sat beside Tommy on the ground, cross-legged, not speaking, not trying to distract him with toys or empty reassurances. She just was. Her presence radiated an almost palpable calm, and in that space of quiet being, something remarkable happened. Tommy's sobs, which had been loud and ragged, began to soften. His breath, catching in his throat, gradually found a more even rhythm. From her cloth bag, Iris produced the cotton ball, offering it to Tommy like a small cloud made tangible. 3 slow breaths, she said in a voice that was more invitation than instruction, demonstrating with her own steady inhalations. Tommy looked at the cotton, then at her, and for reasons he couldn't have explained, he followed her lead. By the 3rd breath, the pain had learned it was allowed to be smaller. When the aide arrived with the cheerful first aid kit and jokes about hero bandages, Tommy was ready to laugh, which meant he was ready to heal. Miss Chen watched from the classroom window, understanding that she was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a particularly empathetic child. This was someone who had arrived carrying a gift the classroom desperately needed. As the days unfolded, she began to notice patterns. Arguments cooled into conversations when Iris was nearby. The restless energy that typically characterized afternoon activities seemed to flow more smoothly around her presence. During rest time, when children usually fought the idea of quiet, they settled more easily when Iris arranged her small treasures around her mat like a protective circle of peace. At exactly 3:17 each afternoon, Miss Chen found herself glancing at the clock without meaning to. The hands didn't stop. They never did. But something in the room would shift, a softening that made papers stack themselves more neatly and chairs tuck in without scraping. The fluorescent lights seemed to hum more gently, and if you listened carefully, you could hear the settling of dust motes dancing in afternoon light. Once, when a sudden thunderstorm sent rain against the windows in sharp bursts, half the class startled with that quick intake of breath that small bodies have. Iris hummed 3 notes, the same melody Willow had taught them, and left the 3rd note unfinished, just breath. The room settled like a sigh, and even the thunder seemed to soften its voice. The lunch hour brought its own revelations. Iris would carefully unwrap her star-shaped sandwich, but instead of eating it immediately, she would break it into smaller pieces with the same ceremonial attention she brought to all her rituals. A piece for Tommy, still carrying the morning's scrape, but now wearing it like a badge of survived adventure. Another for Sarah, whose mother was late again and whose eyes held that particular worry that comes from watching empty doorways. A 3rd piece for Marcus, who sat alone at the puzzle table, not from unfriendliness but from a shyness that felt safer in solitude. Each child who accepted a piece of star-shaped bread seemed to settle more deeply into their chair, their movements becoming less frantic, their voices dropping to the gentle register that children use when they feel truly safe. Miss Chen began to understand that Iris wasn't just sharing food, she was offering small pockets of comfort, reminders that someone had taken the time to spread kindness between slices of warm bread, to fold a moment of peace into something as simple as lunch. By the 2nd week, a corner of the classroom had naturally evolved into what the children began calling the quiet place. Miss Chen had simply moved 2 cushions near the bookshelf and added a small basket, not unlike Iris's own collection, filled with smooth stones and soft fabric squares. A gentle sign appeared, "Come sit. No reason needed." It wasn't that Iris had asked for this space or demanded special accommodation. Rather, the classroom had organically grown around her gift, creating room for the kind of peace she carried so naturally. When conflicts arose, as they inevitably did among children, learning to share and navigate the complex waters of friendship, Iris would often appear at the edges of disagreement like a small ambassador of calm. She didn't mediate with words, her vocabulary was still forming, but with her very being. When two children stood red-faced over possession of the red ball, their small fists clenched with the injustice of it all, Iris would sit in the grass between them, her gaze moving from one to the other without judgment or demand, simply holding space. The sharp energy of their anger would seem to dissipate into the quiet aura she carried, like static electricity grounding. Itself in Willing Earth, the first parent-teacher conference arrived with the scent of autumn leaves and the gentle anxiety that comes with wanting to hear good things about your child. Clara sat in the small chair made for someone much smaller and thought of all the chairs she had occupied since Iris's birth, how each one had taught her something about being present. Miss Chen leaned forward with the attentive kindness of someone who wanted to be accurate about good things. "Your daughter makes room," she said, then searched for better words. "She's like the space at the end of a good sentence. She helps the rest of us land." Clara felt tears gather, not from worry but from recognition, and found herself telling Miss Chen about the night the clocks had rested, about the way 3:17 threaded its way through their days, like a recurring melody that reminded them all to pause and breathe. Miss Chen nodded as if a puzzle piece had clicked into place. "I've been thinking about expanding our quiet corner," she said. "Her may be something that doesn't ask for anything, just offers space." The idea hovered between them like a lantern that would be lit later when the evening called for it. "For now, we'll keep learning from her. She's teaching us all something important about being present." That evening, as Iris walked home with Sam under a sky that had washed itself clean with afternoon rain, their steps fell into the twin rhythm that felt like an old habit. He carried her backpack even though she could manage it herself, and she let him even though they both knew she could. At the corner by the leaning streetlight, the air seemed to hold a breath, and they both noticed without speaking that the world sometimes did that around her, paused, listened, made room for whatever peace she was carrying. Over dinner of soup and star-shaped sandwiches, Iris shared her day in the simple language of a child who had spent it doing important work. "Tommy was hurt," she said, her small fingers tracing the edge of her bowl. "So I gave him a cloud that knew how to wait." The matter-of-fact way she described her intuitive response to another child's distress struck Clara as both remarkable and perfectly natural. Remarkable because it showed wisdom far beyond her years. Natural because it was simply who Iris was. The way breathing was simply what lungs did. Later, as the house settled into its evening rhythm and bedtime stories read themselves into the air with the lingering magic that had become their nightly gift, Iris arranged her quiet kit by her bedside with the same care she brought to everything. The smooth stone went on the nightstand, still holding the day's accumulated sunshine. The cotton ball nestled in the small dish Clara had given her, soft as captured dreams. The wooden button found its place in the tiny jewelry box that played 3 notes of a lullaby when opened. The same melody Willow had hummed in her kitchen, the same tune that seemed to help the world remember how to rest. As night drew its gentle curtain over Millhaven, and the clocks throughout the town marked their quiet time with the respect due to sacred rhythms, the family understood that something beautiful was unfolding. Iris's gift was no longer contained within their walls. It was beginning to flow outward like light from a lighthouse, reaching into classrooms and playgrounds and the hearts of other children who were learning that peace was not just the absence of noise, but the presence of something deeper, something that could be shared like star-shaped sandwiches, gathered like smooth stones, and given as freely as breath itself. In the space between waking and dreaming, as the house settled around them with the satisfied sigh of a day well lived, they all carried the same gentle knowing. Tomorrow would bring another opportunity to practice the art of being peacefully, completely transformatively present in a world that was slowly, gratefully, learning to receive the gift of a child who had been born carrying pieces of peace in her pockets, ready to share them with anyone who needed to remember what calm felt like. The peace that Iris brought to her school days created ripples that flowed back home each evening, but the nights held their own particular challenges, especially for Sam. While the rest of the house settled into the gentle rhythm of sleep, Sam's mind moved like a restless bird that couldn't find its perch. His thoughts would flutter from tomorrow's spelling test to the way his voice had cracked when he'd tried to answer in math class, from the persistent worry that he was somehow failing at the simple act of being 11 years old to the endless loop of questions that had no comfortable answers. He would lie in his narrow bed, counting ceiling cracks by streetlight, his body tired, but his mind racing like a small engine that had forgotten how to idle. The familiar sounds of the house settling, the gentle sigh of old wood adjusting to the night's cooler air, the whisper of wind through the maple outside his window should have been comforting, but instead they seemed to amplify the noise in his head. Sleep felt like a destination he could see but never quite reach, always one thought away, one worry too many to cross the bridge into rest. It was during one of these wakeful hours, when the clock had crept past midnight and settled into the deep quiet that belongs to insomniacs and night shift workers, that Sam first heard the soft thump-scrape rhythm in the hallway. The sound was too deliberate to be their old cat, too purposeful to be the house's usual settling. It carried the careful cadence of someone with important work to do, and when Sam pressed his ear to his bedroom door, the sound paused, as if whatever was making it had also stopped to listen. The gentle thud that followed was unmistakably Iris settling herself onto the floor, and Sam found himself smiling, despite the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in his chest. He could picture her there in the hallway, cross-legged in her small nightgown with its pattern of moons and stars, her cloth bag beside her like a faithful companion. The image was so clear, he could almost see her small hands sorting through her collection of treasures, each item chosen with the careful consideration of someone preparing medicine for a patient she loved. When the soft push came against his door, not a knock but the gentle pressure of something being slid across the threshold, Sam waited a moment before opening it. There she was, exactly as he had imagined, her dark hair catching the hallway light like silk threads, her eyes holding that steady calm that seemed to come from somewhere much older than her years. Between them lay her offering, a cotton ball so white it seemed to glow in the dim light, placed precisely on the invisible line between his room and the hallway, as if she understood that some gifts must be received by choice rather than demand. They didn't speak at first. Sam stepped into the hallway and closed his door behind him, with the careful quiet of conspirators sharing secrets. Iris distributed her small treasures, with the solemnity of someone performing a sacred ritual, the cotton ball soft as a captured cloud, the smooth stone still warm from her small fist, the wooden button that had somehow been transformed into something precious through her attention. As Sam held these simple objects, something extraordinary began to happen. The hamster wheel in his mind, which had been spinning relentlessly for hours, began to slow its frantic revolution. Iris hummed 3 notes, the same melody Grandmother Willow had taught them, the one that seemed to carry the weight of lullabies, sung by mothers and grandmothers across countless generations. She left the 3rd note unfinished, just breath, and in that space of incomplete music, Sam felt something he had almost forgotten, the simple possibility of peace. Not the forced calm that came from telling himself not to worry, but the genuine ease that arrived when worry was allowed to exist, but no longer demanded to be the loudest voice in the room. As the nights passed, their silent vigil evolved into something more elaborate and nourishing. Clara, in her wisdom, began leaving a small loaf of fresh bread and the star cutter on the kitchen counter before bed, understanding without being told that some forms of healing required the sharing of simple food in quiet hours. Iris would pad softly to the kitchen, her bare feet making no sound on the cool floors, and return with 2 star-shaped sandwiches, peanut butter and honey, always cut into triangles, because triangles felt more hopeful than squares. They would sit together on the worn rug in the hallway, the soft glow from Sam's bedside lamp casting long, gentle shadows. The midnight sandwiches became their communion, each bite a small, tangible piece of peace. The sweetness of the honey, the comforting richness of the peanut butter, the soft texture of Clara's carefully baked bread. Each element was a moment of grounded reality in the swirling uncertainties of Sam's anxious mind. They ate in the kind of silence that isn't empty but full, rich with understanding and acceptance. During these shared meals, Sam learned to let his sister's peace become a bridge to his own sleep. He didn't always understand her few words, but he understood her heart completely. He understood the steady, unwavering calm that emanated from her like warmth from a banked fire. a calm that seemed to absorb his restlessness without judgment or demand. He learned that he didn't have to fight his thoughts or chase them away. He could simply sit with them and with Iris and let them gradually soften and recede like distant waves pulling back from the shore. The effects rippled through Sam's days like gentle waves. His teachers noticed the change, the way he raised his hand more readily in class, the easing of the tight lines around his eyes that had made him look older than his 11 years. His sleep grew more consistent, arriving earlier and staying longer, his dreams shifting from anxious loops to gentler narratives filled with familiar faces and safe places. At exactly 3:17 each afternoon, he would find himself pausing without meaning to, caught by a small softening that ran through his body like a reminder that peace was always available, just a breath away. Evan, noticing the night kitchen crumbs that looked like a constellation of ordinary rescue, built Sam a small wooden box with a sliding lid, just big enough to hold a stone, a cotton ball, and a folded square of soft cloth. He sanded the edges silky smooth and carved a tiny notch in one corner, shaped like a star's tip. "In case you need to open it in the dark," he said, handing it to Sam with the same care he brought to finishing furniture, meant for people who would share important conversations over soup. Sam ran his finger along the notch and felt a kind of quiet courage rise, the steady kind that stands up without needing to be seen. He began to carry the box in his backpack, not as a talisman he clutched, but as a promise to himself that he could choose gentleness when the day got sharp. When a quiz appeared face down on his desk and his heart tried to sprint, he would touch the star notch through the cloth of his bag and remember the unfinished note of the lullaby waiting for him at home. When a friend made a joke that landed like a small cut, he pressed his thumb to the place on his palm where the stone usually rested and imagined the warmth anyway. The night that marked their first month of midnight rituals, Sam appeared in Iris's doorway carrying something he had made in Evan's workshop, 2 small wooden shapes carved with patient hands and sanded smooth as river stones. "Trade?" he asked, offering a tiny star and a little boat, both small enough to rest comfortably in her palm. Iris's eyes widened with delight, and she accepted them with the same reverence he had learned from her. "For when you're the lighthouse," he said softly, "and for when you're the harbor." Their bond deepened into something unspoken but unshakable, woven from threads of lavender-scented dreams and triangle-shaped hope. Sam found himself sitting beside classmates who looked overwhelmed, not trying to solve their problems, but simply offering his presence the way Iris had taught him. The quiet corner in Miss Chen's classroom began to feel familiar to him too, a place where he could sit and breathe and remember that peace was not something to be earned, but something to be shared. Like warm bread broken between friends. As autumn deepened into winter and the streetlight outside their house continued its gentle vigil, the family understood that they were witnessing something profound. Iris's gift was not contained within their walls. It was flowing outward like light from a lighthouse, reaching into classrooms and playgrounds and the hearts of other children who were learning that calm was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something deeper, something that could be gathered like smooth stones and given as freely as breath itself. In the space between waking and dreaming, as the house settled around them with the satisfied sigh of work well done, they all carried the same gentle knowing. They were part of something larger than themselves, a quiet revolution of peace that began with one small girl who had been born carrying comfort in her pockets and was now teaching others to find their own treasures, their own ways of being peacefully, completely, transformatively present in a world that was slowly, gratefully, learning to receive the gift of genuine rest. The peace that had settled over their midnight rituals created space for Sam's confidence to grow in daylight hours, his steps lighter on the path to school, his backpack no longer heavy with the weight of unspoken worries. The small wooden box Evan had carved for him remained tucked in his pocket, but now it felt less like a lifeline and more like a gentle reminder, a smooth stone's promise that calm was always within reach, even when the day grew sharp around the edges. As autumn deepened into winter, and the first snow began to dust the streets of Millhaven like powdered sugar sifted over warm bread, Iris's gift seemed to expand naturally beyond the walls of their home, seeking new spaces where peace might take root and flourish. It was Mrs. Patterson, their neighbor who had become such a frequent visitor for tea and quiet conversation, who first suggested the library. She had been the head librarian at Millhaven Public Library for more years than anyone could count. Her silver hair always pinned back with the practical care of someone who spent her days among towering shelves and whispered conversations. "They're always looking for help," she said one snowy afternoon, her voice softer these days, less prone to the quick anxieties that used to flutter through her words like nervous birds. And sometimes, a library needs more than just someone to shelve books. Sometimes it needs someone who can listen to the silence between the words. The library sat on its small hill, like a patient grandmother, its tall windows catching the winter light and sending it back into town, softened, transformed into something warmer and more welcoming. Inside, the air carried the scent of old paper and wood polish, and the particular quiet that comes from thousands of stories resting together in peaceful companionship. Iris stepped across the threshold and felt the building acknowledge her presence, not dramatically, but with the gentle recognition of one quiet soul meeting another. Mrs. Patterson moved among the shelves with the careful grace of someone who understood that books were not just objects but repositories of dreams and wisdom, each one waiting patiently for the right reader to discover its particular gift. She watched as Iris touched a book spine with two careful fingers, the way someone might touch the shoulder of a sleeping friend to wake them gently, and something like recognition passed between librarian and child. "Feel like it here," Mrs. Patterson said, not as a prediction but as a welcome. "This is where quiet comes to rest." Iris began her volunteer work with the same deliberate attention she brought to everything, shelving returned books with the care of someone placing friends back into their proper neighborhoods. She learned the geography of the collection, the way mysteries leaned into their secrets, how cookbooks often fell open to pages marked with the evidence of meals shared with love, the manner in which children's books seemed to vibrate with barely contained giggles and wonder. But more than the books themselves, she noticed the people who moved through the spaces between the shelves, carrying needs that had nothing to do with finding specific titles. There was Mr. Henderson, who came every afternoon since his retirement, not because his house was empty, but because it echoed with too much silence, the wrong kind, sharp and hollow rather than full and nurturing. He would wander the biography section with the careful steps of someone looking for something he couldn't name, his fingers trailing along spines without quite choosing. There was Mrs. Chen, Sam's former teacher, who arrived some evenings, carrying the accumulated weight of 23 small lives on her shoulders, her eyes holding the particular tiredness that comes from caring deeply about children who aren't your own. It was for these silent seekers that Iris began to create what would become known as the Quiet Nook. She didn't announce her intentions or ask permission. She simply began moving with the same intuitive purpose that had guided her midnight rituals with Sam. Two comfortable chairs appeared near the west window, relocated from a storage room with Mrs. Patterson's quiet approval. A small table found its way between them, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. On it, Iris placed a cotton ball in a small glass jar, a smooth stone that caught and held the afternoon light, and a tiny bundle of lavender tied with the same purple ribbon Grandmother Willow had given her months ago. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The corner began to radiate the same peaceful energy that had always surrounded Iris, creating a pocket of sanctuary within the larger quiet of the library. A small sign appeared, written in Iris's careful script and placed at child-eye level. "Come sit. No reason needed." The invitation was simple, without conditions or expectations, offering rest to anyone who felt drawn to accept it. People discovered the space the way they discovered their need for it, gradually, naturally, as if the corner had been waiting for them all along. Mr. Henderson found himself settling into one of the chairs during his afternoon wanderings, a book unopened in his lap, while he watched the snow fall through the tall window. The sharp-edged silence that had followed him from his empty house began to soften around the edges, replaced by something fuller, more nourishing. Iris would appear beside his chair like a gentle presence, not speaking unless spoken to, sometimes placing one of her smooth stones on the arm of his chair, not as a gift to keep, but as a temporary anchor while his thoughts found their way to steadier ground. Mrs. Chen discovered the corner during a particularly difficult week when one of her former students was struggling with his parents' divorce and another was facing her grandmother's illness. She had come seeking books that might help children process grief, but found herself sinking into the second chair, with a weariness that went deeper than physical tiredness. Iris appeared with her usual gentle timing, offering a cotton ball that seemed impossibly soft and a stone that held the warmth of afternoon sunshine. "Some days are heavier than others," Iris said in her clear, small voice, and Mrs. Chen felt tears gather, not because the words were profound, but because they were true and someone had noticed. At exactly 3:17 each afternoon, the library would experience the same gentle pause that had become familiar in their home and at school. The fluorescent lights would hum more softly, the heating system would settle into a quieter rhythm, and even the books seemed to rest more comfortably on their shelves. Mrs. Patterson, who had worked in the building for 30 years, began to recognize this daily moment of grace, the way a lighthouse keeper learns to recognize the rhythm of waves against stone. She would glance at the clock, then at Iris arranging her treasures with ceremonial care, and simply nod with the understanding that some gifts are too precious to question, only to receive with gratitude. The effects began to ripple outward in ways that felt almost magical, but were really just the natural result of genuine care made visible. Patrons lingered longer, their faces softer when they left, their steps lighter as they ventured back into the winter afternoon. The usual hurried energy of people rushing to accomplish errands before dinner seemed to flow more smoothly around the peaceful space Iris had created. Conflicts over overdue fines resolved more easily, and even the most frazzled parents found themselves speaking more gently to their children after spending a few minutes in the quiet nook. One snowy Thursday, when the afternoon light was particularly golden and the library felt especially peaceful, a young woman named Elena entered with a stack of overdue books and an aura of barely contained distress. Her movements were quick and brittle, as if she might shatter at any moment, and her eyes held storms that her wind-chime laughter couldn't quite disguise. Iris, shelving books nearby, felt the familiar pull of someone in need of the particular kind of peace she carried. Without fanfare or dramatic gesture, she simply lit the small candle that waited on the table in the quiet nook, its flame flickering gently like a beacon for weary travelers. Elena found herself drawn to the space by something she couldn't name, her jerky steps gradually slowing as she approached the welcoming chairs. She sank into the worn fabric with a sigh that seemed to release weeks of held tension, her gaze settling on the candle's steady flame. Iris continued her shelving nearby, her presence a quiet anchor in Elena's swirling internal storm. Gradually, the brittleness in Elena's posture began to soften. Her breathing deepened, and the tempest in her eyes gentled into something more manageable, more hopeful. As winter settled more deeply over Millhaven, and the library became a natural gathering place for those seeking warmth both physical and spiritual, Mrs. Patterson understood that she was witnessing something extraordinary. The building had always been a sanctuary for those who loved books and learning, but now it had become something more, a place where people could remember what it felt like to breathe deeply, to sit without agenda, to simply be present in a world that often demanded constant motion. The quiet nook had become more than a corner with comfortable chairs. It had become a reminder that peace was not a luxury reserved for special occasions, but a necessity that could be cultivated and shared. Iris had created something the community didn't know it needed until it existed. A small pocket of sanctuary where people could rest and remember who they were, beneath all the noise and hurry of daily life. As evening approached and the last patrons gathered their things to venture back into the winter night, Iris would hum her 3 soft notes for the room. 2 sounded clearly, 1 left as breath, and Mrs. Patterson would answer by turning the sign on the door from open to closed with the tenderness of someone tucking in a beloved child. Outside, the streetlight leaned in its familiar gesture of welcome, and the town settled into another lesson in the art of peaceful rest. Walking home through streets that sparkled with fresh snow, Iris carried her small cloth bag with the same care she brought to everything, each treasure still holding its purpose, still ready to offer comfort to whoever might need a piece of peace, handed back to them clean and warm. The library had taught her something new about her gift, that it could expand beyond the people she knew and loved, reaching into the hearts of strangers who were really just friends she hadn't met yet, all of them learning together that peace was not something to be hoarded, but something to be shared. Like warm bread broken between companions, like stories told in the gentle hour before sleep, like the quiet that lives at the heart of all things, waiting patiently for someone to remember it's there. In the space between waking and dreaming, as the house settled around them, with the satisfied sigh of work well done, they all carried the same gentle understanding. Iris's gift was growing, flowing outward like light from a lighthouse, creating circles of calm that touched more lives each day, teaching a whole community the revolutionary art of being peacefully, completely transformatively present in a world that was slowly, gratefully, learning to receive such gifts with open hearts and grateful hands. Elena returned to the library the following Thursday, with the careful steps of someone testing whether an invitation was real or imagined, her arms wrapped around a small canvas bag that seemed to hold more than books. The quiet nook's candle waited unlit in the afternoon shadows, and Iris appeared with her usual gentle timing, striking a match with the same unhurried attention she brought to all her rituals. The flame bent once in greeting before standing steady, and the corner settled into its familiar embrace of peace and possibility. They didn't speak immediately, but the silence between them was full rather than empty, rich with the understanding that had begun to grow between them like a plant finding its proper light. Elena unpacked her bag with ceremonial care, revealing squares of colored paper that caught the afternoon light like captured pieces of sky and sunset. "Origami," she said simply, her fingers already beginning the precise folds that would transform flat surfaces into something dimensional and beautiful. "My grandmother taught me. She said it was meditation disguised as play." Iris watched with the focused attention of someone learning a new language, her dark eyes following the careful creases that Elena's nervous fingers pressed into the paper. Valley fold, mountain fold, each movement deliberate and somehow soothing, as if the paper itself was grateful to be shaped into something meaningful. Elena's hands, which had trembled with barely contained energy during her first visit, found steadiness in the ancient art of transformation, her breathing naturally deepening as she worked. "The thing about paper," Elena said, not looking up from the crane taking shape in her palms, "is that it remembers every fold. You can't really undo them completely. The memory stays in the fibers." She glanced at Iris with eyes that held both storms and starlight. "I think people are like that too. We carry the creases of everything that's shaped us, even the things we wish we could smooth out." Iris reached for a square of pale blue paper, her small fingers attempting to mirror Elena's movements. The first attempts were clumsy, the folds uneven, but Elena guided her with the patience of someone who understood that learning was its own form of meditation. Together they created a small flock of paper birds, some perfect, some charmingly lopsided, that found their home on the windowsill of the quiet nook, their wings catching the light like prayers made visible. As the weeks passed, their Thursday afternoons developed their own rhythm, a gentle ritual that wove itself into the fabric of both their lives. Elena would arrive carrying new paper, sometimes traditional origami squares, sometimes pages from old magazines or sheet music that had lost their original purpose, but found new meaning in her creative hands. Iris learned not just the technical aspects of folding, but the deeper lesson Elena was teaching without words, that beauty could emerge from the most unlikely materials, that transformation was always possible, that even broken things could be made into something whole and meaningful. Elena's gift to Iris was the understanding that emotions, like origami paper, could hold multiple folds simultaneously. She could laugh while tears gathered in her eyes, could speak of hope while her hands shook with anxiety, could offer comfort to others while her own heart felt like a bird beating against cage bars. "My mom always told me to pick a feeling and stick with it," Elena confided one afternoon, her fingers working a piece of silver paper into the shape of a star. "But I think that's like telling the sky it can only be one color. Some days I'm the whole weather system." This revelation opened something new in Iris's understanding of her gift. She began to recognize that her ability to create peace wasn't about erasing difficult emotions, but about creating space where they could exist without judgment, where storms could rage and then naturally subside, where someone could be authentically themselves in all their beautiful complexity. Elena's presence taught her that healing wasn't always linear, that peace could coexist with turbulence, that the most profound connections happened not in perfect stillness, but in the courageous embrace of whatever weather needed to be weathered. At exactly 3:17 each Thursday, The library would experience its familiar gentle pause, and both girls would feel the soft settling that had become their shared secret. Eleanor's restless energy would calm slightly, not because it was suppressed, but because it was welcomed, acknowledged, given room to exist alongside the peace that Iris naturally radiated. In these moments, Eleanor would often reach for Iris's hand, a gesture of gratitude for the space to be fully herself without explanation or apology. "You don't try to fix me," Eleanor said one snowy afternoon, wonder in her voice, as if she were discovering something remarkable. "You just stay. You let me be the whole weather system." Iris nodded with the simple certainty of someone who had always known that presence was often the most powerful gift one person could offer another. She was learning that her gift worked both ways. She could not only give peace, but receive the beautiful chaos of another person's authentic self, allowing it to expand her own understanding of what it meant to be fully, genuinely human. Elena began to trust the quiet nook with more of her truths, unfolding her complexities like origami in reverse, spreading out all the complicated pieces of herself without fear of judgment. She spoke of her aunt who kept a stall at the Friday night market, selling small bundles of lavender and handmade soaps, creating pockets of beauty in the midst of commerce. "She says the night market is where the town goes to remember how to breathe," Elena said, tying a purple ribbon around a particularly perfect paper crane. "People come for the cinnamon rolls and stay for the conversation. There's something about lights strung low and the scent of baking bread that makes everyone a little more honest, a little more kind." The mention of the night market settled into the air between them, like a seed finding fertile ground. Iris felt the familiar pull of expansion, the sense that her gift was ready to flow into new spaces, to touch new lives. Elena continued folding paper into increasingly complex shapes, boxes that could hold secrets, flowers that would never wilt, boats that could navigate any storm. And with each creation, she taught Iris something new about the art of transformation, about finding beauty in unexpected places, about the courage required to remain open to all of life's possibilities. Their friendship deepened through shared understanding rather than shared experience, each girl bringing her own particular gifts to their Thursday meetings. Elena's vibrant, sometimes turbulent inner world showed Iris that peace was not a static state, but a dynamic dance between light and shadow, quiet and sound, stillness and movement. Iris's steady, calming presence allowed Elena to explore her own emotional landscape without fear, to let her storms rage and then naturally subside, to discover that she could be both the lightning and the harbor, the question and the answer, the chaos and the peace. As winter deepened and the library became an even more essential gathering place for those seeking warmth, both physical and spiritual, other patrons began to notice the gentle friendship unfolding in the quiet nook. Mrs. Patterson observed how Elena's brittle edges softened in Iris's presence, how her laughter became less defensive and more genuine. Mr. Henderson, still arriving each afternoon with his careful steps and unspoken loneliness, found himself drawn to their corner, not to intrude but to witness the quiet miracle of two souls recognizing each other across the vast differences in their ages and experiences. One particularly peaceful Thursday, when the snow fell in fat, lazy flakes and the library felt especially like a sanctuary, Eleanor folded her last piece of paper, not into a bird or flower, but into a simple envelope that she pressed into Iris's small palm. "For your collection," she said, her wind chime laughter finally carrying more music than defense. A reminder that friendship is also a kind of treasure. Inside, Iris would later discover, Eleanor had written a single sentence in her careful script. "Thank you for teaching me that storms can be beautiful when someone is willing to weather them with you." As they prepared to leave that afternoon, Eleanor mentioned almost casually that her aunt would be at the night market the following Friday, her stall decorated with paper stars and filled with the scent of lavender and possibility. "If you ever want to see where peace goes when it leaves the library," she said with a smile that held both invitation and understanding, "find the stall with the little lights. I'll be there, folding paper birds and learning new ways to be present in the world." Walking home through streets that sparkled with fresh snow, Iris carried Elena's envelope in her cloth bag alongside her other treasures, understanding that her collection had grown to include not just objects that could offer comfort, but relationships that could teach the heart new ways of being present. Eleanor had shown her that her gift was not just about creating calm, but about creating space, room for the full spectrum of human experience, for tears and laughter to exist in the same breath, for friendship to bloom even in the winter of someone's discontent. The friendship had taught them both something profound about the nature of healing. It wasn't about fixing what was broken, but about learning to hold space for whatever needed to be held. Elena's storms had not been calmed by Iris's presence. They had been witnessed, acknowledged, companioned. And in that witnessing, both girls had discovered that peace was not the absence of turbulence, but the presence of someone willing to stand steady in the wind, offering not solutions but solidarity, not answers but the simple, revolutionary gift of authentic presence. As the house settled into its evening rhythm, and stories read themselves into the air with their familiar magic, Iris arranged her treasures with even greater care, each item now carrying not just its own particular comfort, but the memory of being shared, of creating bridges between one heart and another. Elena's envelope took its place among the cotton balls and smooth stones, a reminder that friendship was also a form of treasure, precious not because it was perfect, but because it was real, authentic, willing to hold space for the beautiful complexity of being fully, genuinely, courageously human. The night market waited in the distance like a constellation of possibility, a place where lights hung low and people came to remember how to breathe, where Iris's gift might find new expressions and Elena's storms might discover new skies. The path from library to market had been laid with careful steps, with paper birds and shared silences, with the understanding that peace was large enough to hold all of life's weather, beautiful enough to embrace both the stillness and the storm, and generous enough to be shared like warm bread, broken between friends who had learned to see each other clearly, in all their magnificent, messy, perfectly imperfect humanity. The Friday evening that would weave the night market into the growing tapestry of Iris's gift arrived with the scent of snow and anticipation, the kind of winter night when the air itself seemed to hold space for something beautiful to unfold. Eleanor's invitation from their Thursday afternoon at the library had settled into the family's evening rhythm like a gentle current, and Clara found herself moving through her kitchen with the same deliberate grace Grandmother Willow had taught them, preparing star-shaped shortbread that would crumble like sweet snow on the tongue, each cookie dusted with lavender and wrapped in tissue paper that whispered promises with every step. The walk to the town center felt like following a thread of light through familiar streets, transformed by possibility. String lights had awakened one by one between the old oak trees, each bulb casting warm pools of welcome that defied the winter chill. Sam carried a small wooden sign Evan had carved that morning, its letters painted in gentle cursive, peaceful offerings. The night market existed in that liminal space between day and rest, where people came not just to buy and sell, but to remember what it felt like to move slowly, to let conversation unfold naturally, to breathe in the mingled scents of cinnamon rolls and roasted nuts, and the particular magic that happens when a community gathers in the soft embrace of evening light. Elena met them at the market's heart, where her Aunt Rose had created a stall that felt like a small sanctuary among the gentle chaos. Rose herself was tall and graceful, her silver hair braided with the same purple ribbon that had become a signature of their friendship, her movements carrying the unhurried elegance of someone who understood that the best things in life could not be rushed. Her table held small bundles of lavender, beside handmade soaps and jars of honey that caught the lantern light like captured sunshine, each item arranged with the care of someone who knew that beauty was not luxury, but necessity. "You must be Iris," Rose said, her voice carrying the warmth of ovens and the patience of rising dough. "Eleanor has told me about your quiet corner, how you've taught her that peace is large enough to hold all of life's weather." She gestured to a small space beside her stall, where Elena had already begun hanging paper cranes and stars from fishing line, their delicate forms swaying gently in the evening breeze. "This is where I practice my own version of what you do, creating pockets of beauty that people can carry home, reminders that someone took the time to fold peace into soap and tie it with ribbon." Iris felt the familiar recognition, the sense of meeting someone who spoke the same unspoken language of care made visible. She arranged her star-shaped shortbread with ceremonial attention, each cookie placed on Rose's wooden tray, like a small beacon of comfort. From her cloth bag came the smooth stones that still held afternoon sunshine, the cotton balls soft as captured clouds, and small bundles of lavender that Grandmother Willow had sent with her blessing. The simple sign Sam placed beside the offerings read like an invitation, "Come rest." No reason needed. As evening deepened and the market settled into its most peaceful rhythm, Iris discovered that her gift translated beautifully to this new setting, creating small eddies of calm in the flowing energy of commerce and community. She learned to read the different textures of tiredness that people carried, the bone-deep exhaustion of new parents, their eyes shadowed with sleepless nights, their hands clutching steaming cups of cider, as if for warmth against a cold world. To them she offered star-shaped cookies, with the quiet acknowledgement that some burdens were too heavy to carry alone, watching as they settled onto the small bench Sam had brought, and felt their shoulders drop, their breathing deepen, if only for a few precious minutes. There was the heart-weariness of loss, etched onto the faces of those who wandered the market alone, their gazes distant, their steps carrying the careful weight of grief. Iris would offer them small bundles of lavender, their fragrance a gentle reminder of quiet gardens and peaceful dreams. "For tucking into pillows when sleep feels too far away," she would whisper, not pressing for conversation or offering empty comfort, but simply providing a tangible piece of peace, a soft anchor in a world that felt adrift. At exactly 9:17, the evening echo of their familiar afternoon pause, the market would experience something extraordinary. The string lights seemed to pulse once in quiet recognition, conversations softened to more intimate registers, and people found themselves lingering longer at each stall, as if time itself had decided to move more graciously. Iris would hum her 3 notes, 2 clear, 1 left as breath, and Elena would pause in her paper folding, their eyes meeting with shared understanding that transcended words. In these moments, their corner became more than a place of commerce. It became an unofficial sanctuary where people could remember what it felt like to be held by something larger than their individual worries. It was during one of these peaceful interludes that a man approached their corner with the careful steps of someone who had learned to read weather in all its forms. He wore a coat the color of stormwater, and a knit cap pulled low, and the salt on his cuffs looked like stories that had dried there and decided to stay. His hands were rope-strong and careful, and when he looked at Iris, his eyes held distances, shorelines you could almost see if you knew where to stand. "Am I supposed to pay before I take one?" he asked, his voice gentle with a timbre that reminded Iris of the low note in a foghorn, comfort more than warning. She shook her head and slid a star-shaped cookie toward him, remembering something Grandmother Willow had once said to a customer whose wallet was shy. "Pay with a story if you like," she offered softly. The man's mouth tipped at one corner as he ate the cookie with the deliberation of someone who had learned to make meals last in weather that didn't forgive waste. After the second bite, he breathed in a way that let something settle. After the third, he set one palm flat on the table as if steadying a chart. "Thomas," he said after the quiet had done its work. "Thomas Meridian. I keep the light." He nodded outward, toward where the town gave way to the long, dark shoulder of water, and in the space between his words and the night, something like possibility turned over, and noticed it had a heartbeat. Elena, close enough to hear but wise enough to pretend she hadn't, folded a paper boat without looking, and set it near Thomas's weathered hand. He smiled like a man remembering why he had ever believed in lighthouses. "Thank you," he said to Iris in a tone that included the cookie and the quiet, and the way she had looked at him without asking his storms to settle. That was exactly the shape I needed. He left a card, not because their corner asked for such things, but because sometimes leaving a thread is its own kind of hope. The card was simple, its edges softened by pockets and weather. A small drawing of a lighthouse stood at the top, and beneath it his name and the words Millhaven Light. "If you ever want to see how light learns to reach," he said, almost to the table, as if it were the sort of thing one said to a trusted piece of wood, "we're always looking for steady hands." As the evening wound toward its gentle close, and vendors began the ritual of packing their wares with the same care they had used to display them, Rose pressed a small bundle into Iris's hands, lavender tied with purple ribbon, and a bar of soap that smelled like summer meadows. "For your collection," she said with a smile that held both gratitude and recognition. A reminder that peace can be packaged and carried home. shared with anyone who needs to remember what calm feels like. Elena added her own gift, a paper crane folded from sheet music, its wings inscribed with words of friendship and understanding. "For when you need to remember that transformation is always possible," she said, her wind chime laughter now carrying more music than defense, her storms having learned they could be beautiful when someone was willing to weather them alongside. Walking home through streets that still held the warm glow of the market's lanterns in their memory, the family carried more than purchases. They carried the understanding that Iris's gift was continuing to expand, to find new expressions and touch new lives. Sam swung his empty basket with the satisfaction of work well done, his wooden box safe in his pocket, but no longer needed as a lifeline, now simply a reminder that peace was always within reach. Clara and Evan exchanged glances that spoke of pride and wonder, watching their daughter navigate this new community with the same gentle grace she brought to everything. The night market had become another sanctuary, another space where peace could take root and flourish, where the simple act of being present could transform commerce into communion, transactions into connections, buying and selling into the deeper exchange of recognition and care. As the house settled into its evening rhythm and bedtime stories read themselves into the air with their familiar magic, Iris arranged her newest treasures alongside the old ones, Rose's lavender and soap, Elena's musical crane and Thomas's card, which seemed to hold the promise of horizons not yet explored. That night, as she hummed her 3 notes and left the third as breath, Iris held Thomas's card between her small palms, as if warming it might wake it a little more. She didn't know yet what the lighthouse would ask of her, or what she might learn to offer it. She only knew that the way he had said light made something inside her stand quietly at attention, as if a part of her had recognized a distant relative calling from across the water. The night market had taught her that her gift was not contained within any single building or limited to the people she knew by name. It was something that could flow wherever kindness was needed, wherever someone had forgotten how to rest, wherever the simple presence of peace could remind people that they were held by something larger than their individual sorrows. In the space between waking and dreaming, as the town settled around them with the satisfied sigh of a day well lived, they all carried the same gentle knowing. Iris's gift was growing, flowing outward like light from a lighthouse, creating circles of calm that touched more lives each day, teaching a whole community the revolutionary art of being peacefully, completely transformatively present in a world that was slowly, gratefully, learning to receive such gifts with open hearts and grateful hands. Somewhere beyond the edge of town, a light continued its patient turning, steady and unafraid, waiting for the right moment to welcome a small girl who carried pieces of peace in her pockets, ready to learn new ways of sharing them with a world that would always need more light. Thomas Meridian's card remained on Iris's nightstand through the gentle turning of seasons, its edges growing softer with the careful attention of small fingers that traced the lighthouse drawing each evening before sleep. When summer arrived with its long golden afternoons and the promise of unhurried days, the card seemed to pulse with quiet invitation, and Clara found her daughter standing at the kitchen window one morning, pressing the worn paper against the glass as if trying to see through it to the horizon beyond. The lighthouse stood where the land surrendered to the endless conversation between stone and sea, its white tower rising like a patient sentinel against the blue immensity of sky and water. The air here carried different stories, salt and wind and the ancient rhythm of waves against rock, the lonely cry of gulls weaving through the constant whisper of tide and time. Thomas appeared in the doorway of the keeper's cottage as if he had been expecting them, his weathered face creasing into lines that spoke of years spent reading the moods of sky and water, his hands rope-strong and careful, shaped by the daily rituals of tending light in darkness. "Light calls to light," he said simply, his voice carrying the low, steady timbre of someone who had learned to speak to distances. "Come see how we tend it." The lighthouse interior was a spiral of worn stone steps and windows that framed the sea like a series of moving paintings, each one capturing a different mood of the eternal dance between water and sky. They climbed without hurry, pausing where small windows offered glimpses of the world growing larger and more magnificent with each ascending turn. At the top, the lens room took Iris's breath away with its geometry of light and possibility. The great Fresnel lens sat like a jewel in its bronze housing, its faceted surfaces designed to gather every ray of sunlight and transform it into something more concentrated, more purposeful. "She's been turning here for 73 years, Thomas said, his hand resting on the lens housing with the tenderness of someone greeting an old friend. "Sending her light 20 miles out to sea. Ships don't need the brightest light. They need the most reliable one. Something they can count on to be exactly where it should be, exactly when they need it." Iris approached the lens with the same reverence she brought to all sacred spaces, understanding instinctively that she stood in the presence of something that served a purpose larger than itself. As Thomas began the evening ritual of lighting the beacon, adjusting the flame with practiced precision, something inside Iris recognized the ceremony as kin to her own daily practices of gathering and giving peace. She learned the patient choreography of tending, how to clean the lens with cloths that wouldn't scratch its delicate surface, how to trim the wick for the most efficient burn, how to read the weather in the color of distant clouds and record observations in the leather-bound logbook that held decades of careful watching. It was during these quiet hours of shared duty that Thomas's story began to unfold, not in dramatic revelation, but in the gentle way that trust builds through working side by side toward a common purpose. He spoke of his daughter Lily, whose presence was woven into the fabric of the lighthouse, a small painted birdhouse on the gallery rail, a worn copy of Sea Stories tucked into a shelf. The way his gaze would sometimes drift toward the horizon with a lingering ache. She was small, he said one afternoon, when fog wrapped the tower and the world beyond the windows disappeared into grey mystery. But she could read a chart the way some children read the faces of people they love. The weather turned without warning. Sometimes it does that. Iris didn't offer empty comfort or try to fill the silence with words. She simply sat beside him in the space where grief lived, her presence creating room for the ache to exist without judgment. From her cloth bag, she produced one of her smooth stones, placing it gently on the table between them, not as a gift to keep, but as a temporary anchor while his memories found their way to steadier ground. In that simple gesture, his loss was witnessed, acknowledged, held by someone who understood that healing often looked like sitting quietly together, while pain learned it could be carried without breaking the one who bore it. At exactly 3:17 each afternoon, the lighthouse would experience the same gentle pause that had become familiar in all the places where Iris's gift took root. The great lens would seem to gather light more efficiently, its beam reaching farther across the water with unusual clarity. The seabirds that nested in the tower's crevices would settle into quieter patterns, and even the waves seemed to approach the rocks with less violence, more rhythm. Thomas began to recognize this daily moment of grace, the way a musician learns to feel the perfect tuning of an instrument. As summer deepened, Iris's influence began to ripple outward across the water in ways that felt miraculous, but were really just the natural result of genuine care made visible. Fishing boats reported unusually calm waters near the lighthouse, and several captains mentioned that the beacon seemed warmer, more welcoming than they remembered. The harbour master began to speak of something he couldn't quite name, a sense that ships navigated more safely when approaching from the direction of Thomas's light, as if the beam carried not just illumination, but some deeper form of guidance. A one-footed gull took to visiting the gallery rail during maintenance days, standing there like a small, stubborn apprentice, and Thomas called it Lieutenant, with the fond exasperation of someone who had learned to find company in unexpected places. The lighthouse cat, fog-colored and independent, would sit on Iris's lap when she read the keeper's log, as if stories liked to be anchored by purrs and the steady presence of someone who listened without judgment. On her last evening, as autumn painted the sky in shades of farewell and promise, Thomas placed a small piece of sea glass in Iris's palm, worn translucent by the ocean's patient work, smooth as a prayer polished by countless tides. "For your collection," he said, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude and understanding. A reminder that even the sharpest edges can be softened by time and gentle presence. Walking home through streets that held the warm memory of summer evenings, Iris carried the sea glass like a tangible piece of the vastness she had witnessed and tended. The lighthouse had taught her that her gift was not confined to quiet corners and gentle conversations. It could reach across great distances, touching lives she might never meet, offering guidance to souls navigating their own storms. She understood now that being a harbor didn't mean staying in one place. Sometimes harbors could visit the restless spaces, carrying peace-like light carried across dark water, steady and unafraid, a gentle promise that even in the deepest darkness, there was always enough light to find the way home. In the space between waking and dreaming, as the house settled around them with the satisfied sigh of work well done, Iris arranged the sea glass among her treasures, its smooth surface holding light even in the darkness of her room. She hummed her 3 notes, leaving the third as breath, and felt the deep connection between the lighthouse's patient beam and the quiet light she carried within, both reaching, both guiding, both offering the simple, revolutionary gift of reliable presence in an unreliable world. The sea glass from Thomas Meridian's lighthouse caught the morning light on Iris's nightstand like a small captured piece of ocean, its translucent depths holding memories of waves, and the patient work of time transforming sharp edges into something beautiful. As autumn painted Millhaven in shades of gold and letting go, the smooth token served as a daily reminder that peace could reach across great distances, steady and reliable as a lighthouse beam cutting through darkness. It was during these shorter days, when the afternoon light slanted through windows with particular warmth, that Iris first encountered the workshop where wood shavings danced in golden air and the scent of honest work mingled with the promise of comfort yet to be built. David had arrived in Millhaven the way gentle weather does, changing the light without announcement, settling into the rhythm of the town as if he had always been meant to find his way there. His workshop sat at the corner of Maple and Third, its wide windows offering glimpses of careful hands, shaping curves that invited rest, surfaces that seemed to glow with inner warmth. He worked with the same deliberate attention that Iris brought to her own rituals, understanding that furniture was more than mere function. Each piece carried the potential to hold someone's weariness, to offer the kind of support that went deeper than physical comfort. Evan had mentioned him first, returning from the hardware store with wood stain and the satisfied expression of someone who had found a kindred spirit. "Good hands," he said simply, setting his purchases on the kitchen table. "Listens to what the wood wants to become instead of forcing it into shapes." Clara, spreading 17 strokes of butter on bread for their afternoon sandwiches, nodded with the understanding of someone who recognized the language of patient craft. "Sounds like someone Iris might appreciate," she said, not as suggestion, but as gentle observation. Their first meeting happened the way important things often do in small towns, without fanfare, but with the quiet inevitability of streams finding their way to the same river. Iris was delivering star-shaped cookies to the shopkeepers along Main Street, her cloth bag lighter these days, but no less purposeful, when the scent of fresh pine shavings drew her to David's open door. She paused at the threshold, watching him work on what would become a rocking chair, his movements unhurried and sure, his focus a quiet intensity that felt familiar as her own deep concentration. He looked up as her shadow fell across his workbench, and something in the air between them shifted, not dramatically, but with the gentle recognition of 2 people who spoke similar languages of care and attention. His eyes held the steady warmth of well-seasoned oak, and when he smiled, it carried the same quality as furniture that had been sanded to perfection. Smooth, welcoming, built to last. "You must be Iris," he said, setting down his plane with the careful attention he brought to everything. "I've heard about your quiet corners, how furniture settles better where you've been." He gestured to the half-finished chair, its curves already promising comfort. "I've been wondering if you might help me understand something, how to build rest into the wood itself, not just the shape." From her cloth bag, Iris produced her smooth stone, placing it gently on the chair's emerging seat, where afternoon light made it seem to glow with captured sunshine. 17 strokes, she said softly, remembering Grandmother Willow's lessons about spreading more than butter, about folding intention into ordinary things. Then 3 quiet breaths. Everything takes a soft twist. Her small fingers demonstrated on the chair's arm, not sanding but simply touching, as if introducing her calm to the wood's natural grain. David watched with the focused attention of someone learning a new language, understanding that Iris was teaching him something profound about the relationship between maker and material, between intention and creation. He began to incorporate her gentle rhythm into his work, 17 careful passes with the sandpaper, 3 breaths to let the wood rest, then the soft twist that seemed to release tension from both material and craftsman. Under this patient attention, the rocking chair began to radiate something more than functionality. It began to carry the promise of peace. Their collaboration developed naturally over the following weeks, the workshop becoming another sanctuary where Iris's gift could take root and flourish. She learned the names of different woods, maple that caught light like captured laughter, oak that held strength like a promise, pine that carried the memory of forests and wind. Each type required its own approach, its own rhythm of care, and Iris discovered that her ability to read emotional weather extended to understanding what each piece needed to become its most beautiful self. At exactly 3:17 each afternoon, the workshop would experience its own version of the gentle pause that had become familiar wherever Iris's presence took root. The tools would rest more quietly in their holders, sawdust would settle in graceful patterns, and the very air would hold a quality of expectation. David began to recognize this daily moment of grace, the way his hands would naturally slow, the way difficult joints would suddenly align with unexpected ease. As the rocking chair neared completion, people began stopping by the workshop, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Mrs. Chen arrived with tea and stayed to organize wood scraps, her teacher's hands finding useful work, while her heart found rest. Elena appeared with a paper crane folded from sheet music, hanging it where it caught light and cast dancing shadows. The workshop had become more than a place of craft. It had become a gathering space where peace could be built into the very structure of things. The completed chair stood in the afternoon, light like meditation made manifest, its curves inviting, its finish glowing with countless careful touches. When Iris settled into its embrace, the chair seemed to recognize her, finding exactly the rhythm her body needed. David watched with wonder, understanding that he had learned to build more than furniture. He had learned to construct comfort itself. That evening, he presented her with a small wooden box crafted using their shared techniques. Its lid fitted to close with a whisper, its interior lined with fabric soft as captured clouds. "For your collection," he said, his voice carrying gratitude and recognition. Inside lay a wooden heart, sanded smooth as sea glass, warm with the promise of hands that had learned to work with love. Walking home through streets that held the memory of afternoon light and honest work, Iris carried David's box like a tangible piece of their collaboration. The workshop had taught her that peace could be embedded in the very structure of things, built into furniture that would carry comfort into homes she might never visit, touching lives she might never meet. In the space between waking and dreaming, she arranged her treasures in the soft-lined box, understanding that love, like her gift, was not just a feeling but a practice, not just a moment but a way of being that transformed everything it touched. The wooden heart David had crafted with such careful attention remained on Iris's nightstand, its smooth surface warming under her fingers each morning, like a small sun that had learned to fit perfectly in the palm of a hand. Their collaboration in the workshop had planted seeds that took root in unexpected places, and as winter gave way to spring's gentle insistence, their shared understanding of building peace into the very structure of things began to shape something larger and more permanent than furniture. What had begun as afternoons spent learning each other's rhythms of work gradually expanded into evenings, shared over simple meals, their conversation flowing between the practical language of wood grain and measurements and the deeper understanding of two souls who recognized in each other a kindred commitment to creating spaces where rest could flourish. David's courtship of Iris unfolded with the same patient grace that characterized all their work. Together, not through dramatic gestures or passionate declarations, but through the accumulation of small kindnesses that built trust the way his careful sanding built smoothness into rough wood. He crafted a reading stand perfectly angled for her afternoon ritual with library books, its height adjusted precisely to the curve of her shoulders as she sat in the rocking chair they had made together. He carved wooden spoons that made stirring honey into tea feel like ceremony, their handles worn smooth as river stones, their bowls shaped to hold exactly the right measure of sweetness. The proposal, when it came, arrived like everything else in their relationship, quietly, naturally, as the logical next step in a dance they had been learning together through countless shared moments. On the spring morning when Grandmother Willow's lilacs bloomed in purple abundance and the air carried promises of renewal, David presented Iris with a small wooden box crafted from maple that seemed to hold light within its grain. Inside, nestled on fabric soft as captured clouds, lay a ring he had carved from driftwood Thomas had given him, wood that had been shaped by countless tides, smoothed by the patient work of time and water, until it held the memory of both storm and calm. "Will you help me build a life?" he asked, his voice carrying the same steady warmth as well-seasoned oak, and Iris's yes arrived like the soft click of a perfectly fitted joint, not dramatic or urgent, but right, inevitable, the natural conclusion of two hearts learning to work in harmony. Their home, when they created it together, became more than shelter. It evolved into a sanctuary that seemed to expand without growing larger, as if the walls themselves were learning to hold a little more kindness each day. The kitchen table, crafted from a single piece of reclaimed oak and sanded with their shared rhythm of 17 strokes and 3 quiet breaths, became the heart of their shared sanctuary. Its surface, worn smooth by the stories it had already witnessed in its former life, radiated an inviting warmth that made everyone who sat there feel instantly at ease. Clara had taught Iris to bake bread using Grandmother Willow's patient methods, and their kitchen filled daily with the scent of rising dough and the particular magic that happens when food is prepared. With love as the primary ingredient, people began arriving at their table the way they had once sought out Iris's quiet corners, not through formal invitation, but through the gentle magnetism of a space where genuine rest could be found. Mrs. Patterson brought her grief over her husband's recent passing and found it held gently, not erased but companioned by the kind of presence that made sorrow bearable. Elena, now a young woman whose storms had learned to dance with starlight, would arrive with her origami paper and transform flat surfaces into delicate cranes that caught the light like prayers made visible. Sam, grown steady and sure, contributed pieces he had crafted in Evan's workshop, each one carrying the understanding that he was helping to build the sanctuary that had once saved his own restless nights. At exactly 3:17 each afternoon, their house would experience the same gentle pause that had become familiar wherever Iris's gift took root. But now the effect seemed amplified by the furniture David had crafted with such loving attention. The chairs would settle more deeply into their places, the table would seem to expand its capacity for welcome, and even the floorboards would creak with the satisfied sound of a home, fulfilling its deepest purpose. Their house had learned to bow, to listen, to create space where healing could happen naturally, through the simple revolutionary act of being seen, being held, being reminded that peace was not a luxury, but a necessity that could be shared like warm bread broken between friends. Word traveled the way kindness does, slowly at first, then all at once, finding its way into conversations at the market and whispered between library shelves. Their home became legendary in quiet ways, spoken of as the place where you can finally breathe, where the simple act of sharing soup and star-shaped sandwiches became communion, where every small gesture of hospitality was really an invitation to remember what it felt like to be fully, authentically, peacefully present in a world that was slowly, gratefully, learning to receive such gifts with open hearts and grateful hands. The transformation from sanctuary to school happened, the way dawn becomes morning, so gradually that no one could pinpoint the exact moment when their kitchen table conversations became something larger, more intentional. People had been arriving at Iris and David's home, carrying questions that went deeper than requests for tea and comfort, their eyes holding the particular hunger of souls who had tasted peace and wanted to learn its recipe. Mrs. Patterson was the first to voice what others had been feeling, her weathered hands tracing the grain of their oak table as if reading a map written in wood. "You've shown us what this feels like," she said softly, "but how do we carry it home? How do we build it into our own walls?" The question settled into the air between them like a seed finding fertile ground, and over the following weeks, Iris began to understand that her gift had grown beyond individual moments of comfort into something that could be cultivated and passed along. She started noticing how visitors lingered after the last crumbs were brushed away, their posture shifting from the tight vigilance of people carrying too much to the softer stance of those who had remembered how to breathe deeply. They asked not just for more of what she offered, but for the tools to offer it themselves, Their first workshop took place in the community center's basement, a space that had hosted everything from bingo nights to grief support groups, its fluorescent lights harsh, and its folding chairs arranged with institutional efficiency. But as Iris began to speak, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime practicing what she taught, the room began to transform. She showed the dozen participants how to recognize the different textures of silence, the way empty quiet felt different from full quiet, how one drained energy while the other restored it. Peace isn't the absence of feeling, she said, her hands demonstrating the gentle pressure that could draw tension from tired shoulders. There's the presence of space where all feelings can exist without judgment. She taught them the rhythm that had become sacred in their home, 17 strokes of attention, 3 quiet breaths, then the soft twist that released whatever needed releasing. Whether applied to kneading bread, sanding wood, or simply sitting with someone's pain, the pattern created space for healing to happen naturally. Elena arrived with squares of colored paper, her gift for transformation through folding, complementing the deeper work of emotional origami that Iris taught. Together they showed participants how to take the sharp edges of difficult days and fold them into something more manageable, more beautiful. "We don't smooth out the creases," Elena explained, her fingers working paper into a delicate crane. "We learn to see how they make us stronger, more interesting, more real." Sam, now a young man whose journey through anxiety had become a source of strength rather than shame, began co-facilitating sessions for teenagers. He spoke of midnight sandwiches and wooden boxes, of learning that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to sit with it until it transformed into something workable. David crafted meditation cushions and small wooden bowls for holding smooth stones, each piece made with the understanding that sometimes peace needed physical anchors, tangible reminders that calm could be held in the palm of a hand. At exactly 3:17 during each session, the rooms would experience the familiar pause that had become Iris's signature, a softening that made papers stack themselves more neatly and chairs settle into more comfortable positions. Participants began setting gentle alarms for this time in their own lives, creating a synchronized moment of stillness that rippled through Millhaven like a daily tide of calm. The grocery store would witness tiny stillnesses near the produce section. The bus would have a minute where all shoulders dropped simultaneously, and classrooms throughout the town would fall into the kind of quiet that made children's courage rise. The workshops grew organically, moving from the community center to church basements, library meeting rooms, wherever space could be found and hearts were willing to listen. Iris taught them to create quiet kits, small collections of objects that held personal meaning, tangible anchors to moments of peace. A smooth stone from a beloved beach, a cotton ball soft as captured clouds, a small wooden token crafted with intention. These became portable sanctuaries, reminders that peace was always within reach. Mrs. Chen discovered that the techniques worked as well with restless 8-year-olds as they did with anxious adults, her classroom becoming another pocket of calm in the expanding network. The library's quiet nook inspired similar spaces in the hospital, the courthouse, even the local clinic. Rose from the night market began incorporating the gentle rhythms into her soap making, each bar carrying the intention of the 17 strokes and 3 breaths. There were challenging moments too, because rooms that invited truth would inevitably meet it. A teenager arrived carrying his father's anger in his nervous system, sitting in corners, until the space taught him he could move closer to others without losing himself. A widow spoke of silence that felt like falling, and the circle learned to be the net that held without fixing, that witnessed without trying to solve. As autumn painted the world in shades of letting go, Iris began to see the quiet truth of her evolving role. She was no longer the only lighthouse in the harbor. She had taught others to tend their own lights, to create their own circles of calm, to pass along the revolutionary understanding that peace was not something to be hoarded, but something to be shared. The workshops had become self-sustaining, with former participants becoming facilitators, the gift flowing outward like light from countless small beacons. Walking home through streets where people paused at 3:17 to breathe deeply, where conflicts resolved more gently, and strangers made eye contact with genuine warmth, Iris carried the deep satisfaction of work that had grown beyond her individual efforts into something larger and more enduring. She had taught a community to remember what it had always known, but had temporarily forgotten, that everyone carried the capacity for sanctuary, that peace was not a rare gift, but a skill that could be cultivated, that the simple act of being present could transform not just individual hearts, but the very fabric of daily life. In the space between waking and dreaming, as their house settled around them with the satisfied sigh of work well done, Iris and David understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. What had begun with one small girl who carried pieces of peace in her pockets had grown into a community-wide practice of presence, a shared commitment to creating sanctuary wherever it was needed. The circle was widening, the light was spreading, and in the gentle rhythm of shared breath and synchronized stillness, a quiet revolution of kindness continued to unfold, one peaceful moment at a time. The quiet revolution that had taken root in Millhaven's community centers and church basements began to blossom in the most unexpected corners of daily life, transforming the town not through grand declarations, but with the persistent gentleness of spring arriving one green shoot at a time. Former workshop participants had become facilitators themselves, carrying the techniques like seeds that found fertile ground in the most ordinary moments. A bus driver who learned to recognize the 317 pause in his passenger's collective exhale, a high school student who placed smooth stones in a lunch basket and watched defensive laughter soften into something more genuine, a courthouse judge who kept a small wooden token on her bench and counted 17 words before speaking on the hardest days. Elena's path had unfolded, with the same natural grace as paper remembering its folds, each crease leading inevitably to the next. Her counseling practice occupied a small room above the bookstore, furnished not with intimidating leather furniture, but with chairs David had crafted, and a low table where paper cranes perched like silent witnesses to the unfolding of human stories. "You don't have to choose one feeling," she would tell clients whose hearts argued with themselves, her wind chime laughter now carrying more music than defense. "You can be the whole weather system. I'll sit with you through the storm." Her office held the same quality of sanctuary that Iris had always created, space where transformation could happen without force, where healing arrived through presence rather than pressure. Sam's journey from restless boy to steady young man had given him a profound empathy for others navigating their own storms. He found himself teaching meditation not in formal classes, but in relaxed circles in the park, speaking of midnight sandwiches and wooden boxes, of learning that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to sit with it until it transformed. His voice, once prone to cracking under pressure, now carried the steady timbre of someone who had found his own calm center. "You don't have to feel better," he would tell the teenagers who gathered around him. "You can just be gentle." Star-shaped sandwiches appeared on paper plates each week, and no one needed to ask where they came from. At exactly 3:17 each afternoon, the synchronized pause had become so natural to Millhaven that visitors often remarked on the town's unusual rhythm. Mr. O'Malley, the bus driver, would find his passengers settling into that particular posture the town had learned together. Spines upright without stiffness, hands easy, mouth softened by readiness to greet rather than guard. Judge Herrera kept a smooth stone on her bench, turning it in her palm before addressing rooms thick with tension. 17 words, then breathe," she would whisper to herself, and somehow conflicts that might have escalated found their way to resolution instead. The ripples reached places where decisions carried weight and stress had once ruled unchallenged. In the factory, a foreman known for his temper began starting shift meetings with 1 minute of stillness he simply called the quiet check. Productivity didn't drop, injuries did. Nurse Lila at the clinic taped a purple ribbon to her supply cart, counting gentle swipes when washing a frightened child's arm, letting the rhythm steady both her hands and the room. Even the grocery store cashiers found themselves moving with more deliberate grace, their scanning and bagging taking on the quality of meditation. As Iris entered her later years, her gift had become so integrated into her being that she barely noticed it anymore, like breathing it simply was. She and David spent their evenings on the porch they had built together, watching the sun set over the town they had helped nurture into something special. The conscious effort of her childhood had evolved into something as natural as gravity, her presence automatically creating conditions where healing could happen. She understood now that her life's work had never been about her individual gift, but about awakening the capacity for peace that existed in everyone the town spread. Below them, like a constellation of small lights, each window holding a story of transformation. Children who had grown up in Iris's presence were now parents themselves, cutting their own children's sandwiches into star shapes without thinking about it, counting 17 strokes when brushing hair, pausing for 3 quiet breaths before responding to tantrums. The gift was becoming generational, woven into the DNA of families who had learned that peace was not just a feeling, but a practice. There were challenges too, because a place that invites truth will hear all of it. When a summer heatwave pressed over Millhaven and the power failed, darkness brought its old companion of unease. But then, somewhere on 3rd Street, someone hummed 2 notes and left the third as breath. Windows opened, neighbors called to one another with careful care, and at 9:17, an evening echo of the town's daily heartbeat, houses set candles in their windows like gentle conversation across the dark. The power returned to find that rest had not waited for it. Walking through their house one last time before bed, Iris touched the familiar surfaces that held decades of shared meals and gentle conversations. Her collection of treasures had evolved over the years, some items finding new homes with people who needed them, others remaining as anchors to moments of grace. She had learned that she was not a source but a conduit, not a healer, but a reminder that everyone carried pieces of peace in their pockets. They had simply forgotten how to find them. The quiet revolution continued its gentle expansion, carried forward by all the hearts that had learned to beat in rhythm with the daily pause, all the hands taught to work with patience, all the souls who had discovered that peace was not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something deeper, something that could be cultivated like a garden, shared like bread, and passed along like the most precious inheritance one generation could leave for the next. The evening light that fell through their kitchen windows had grown softer over the years, or perhaps it was Iris who had learned to receive it more gently, her eyes carrying the particular wisdom that comes from a lifetime spent creating sanctuary wherever it was needed. At 73, her gift had become so seamlessly woven into the fabric of her being that she no longer thought of it as something she possessed, but rather as something that flowed through her like breath itself. The oak table that had served as the heart of their home bore the gentle scars of countless meals shared and stories told, its surface worn smooth by decades of elbows, resting in comfortable conversation. David moved around their kitchen with the same unhurried grace that had characterized their entire life together, his hands still steady as they measured tea and arranged the star-shaped cookies that had become their evening ritual. His workshop still hummed with quiet activity, though the pieces he crafted now were fewer and deeper. Chairs that understood grief without collapsing under it, tables that knew how to wait for someone to speak, small boxes that closed with the quiet confidence of trust. Each finished piece carried the rhythm Iris had taught him decades ago. 17 passes, 3 breaths, the soft twist that released whatever needed releasing. The town of Millhaven had grown around the practices she had taught, its daily rhythms shaped by the understanding that peace was not a luxury, but a necessity that could be cultivated and shared. The 317 pause had become so natural that children learned it alongside their multiplication tables, and visitors often remarked on the unusual quality of kindness that seemed to permeate even the most ordinary interactions. At grocery stores, clerks moved with deliberate grace. Bus drivers waited an extra moment for hurried passengers. Teachers paused before speaking to restless classrooms, counting 17 words in their minds before offering guidance. Sam visited most Sundays, often arriving early to brew tea the way Iris liked it. Honey stirred in slow circles that made the light gather and linger. Now a man of quiet strength and deep compassion, he brought his own children, their laughter filling the house with joyous energy that was both new and deeply familiar. He would tell them stories of midnight sandwiches and wooden boxes, of learning that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to sit with it until it transformed into something workable. His children would listen with wide-eyed wonder, their small hands tracing smooth stones in their own quiet kits, understanding that peace was not a destination, but a journey shared between generations like precious inheritance. Elena's wind-chime laughter had deepened over the years, mellowed by the understanding that she could be the whole weather system and still find her way to peace. Her counseling practice thrived on the foundation of what Iris had taught her, that healing often looked like sitting quietly together, while storms learned they could be beautiful, when someone was willing to weather them alongside. She would sometimes bring clients to sit on Iris and David's porch, not for direct intervention, but simply to let them breathe in the atmosphere of deep calm that permeated their home. On a clear afternoon in early autumn, Thomas sent a note written in his tidy, stubborn script. There is still tending in a world of switches. Come when the weather is honest. They drove out along the old road to where the lighthouse stood patient and white against the endless conversation between stone and sea. Thomas met them at the path, older now but sanded to softness by salt and wind and time. They climbed the spiral steps one more time, slower than before, pausing at each window to let the horizon do its quiet work. The great lens stood in her glass room like a cathedral built from patience. "You brought the same thing we bring," Thomas said, leaning on the brass with familiar tenderness. "Reliability. That's all anyone really needs at sea." He pressed a shard of sea glass into her palm, worn translucent by the ocean's patient work. No longer sharp, just light you could hold. Iris reflected on a life lived not in grand gestures, but in countless small acts of grace. Her heroism had been of a quieter, more profound kind, the heroism of being present, of listening between words, of offering gentle anchor in a turbulent world. She understood now that her life's work had been to be a conduit through which peace could flow. Like Thomas's lighthouse lens, she had gathered scattered light of human kindness and focused it, sending its steady beam across dark waters of uncertainty, guiding others toward their own safe harbors. As twilight deepened, wrapping the town in soft embrace, Iris would hum her 3 notes, leaving the third as breath, as if to remind herself and the world that some melodies are meant to be completed not by sound, but by stillness. David would reach for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwined with hers, a silent acknowledgement of the long, beautiful journey they had traveled together. She felt no fear, as shadows lengthened. Only deep sense of completion, like a story that had found its perfect rhythm not in dramatic climax, but in quiet, lingering resonance of gentle continuance. Her legacy lived not in what she had built or achieved, but in countless hearts she had touched, helping them remember the peace that resided within themselves, waiting patiently to be rediscovered, shared like warm bread broken between friends who had learned the revolutionary art of being peacefully, completely, transformatively present in a world that would always need more light. Walking through their house one last time before bed, Iris touched familiar surfaces that held decades of shared meals and gentle conversations, understanding that she was not a source but a conduit, not a healer, but a reminder that everyone carried pieces of peace in their pockets. They had simply forgotten how to find them. The quiet revolution continued its gentle expansion, carried forward by all the hearts that had learned to beat in rhythm with the daily pause, ready to be passed along like the most precious inheritance one generation could leave for the next. The morning that would be Iris's last arrived wrapped in the golden light of late autumn, carrying the scent of bread rising and the particular tenderness that comes when seasons prepare to turn their pages. She moved through her familiar rituals with the same deliberate grace that had shaped decades of peaceful mornings, but there was something different in the quality of her attention, deeper, more complete, as if she was savoring each small gesture like a prayer offered with perfect presence. The star-shaped sandwiches emerged from her careful cutting like small blessings made tangible, each one carrying the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent folding peace into ordinary things. David watched from his place at their oak table, its surface worn smooth by countless conversations and marked with the gentle scars of a life fully shared. He understood without words that something profound was shifting, the way a craftsman recognizes when a piece is finally ready, every edge smoothed, every joint fitted with the patience of hands that had learned to work with love as the primary tool. Her movements held the satisfied quality of work nearing completion, not hurried toward conclusion, but settled into perfect readiness. Sam arrived first, his children now carrying their own quiet kits, their small hands understanding the weight of smooth stones and the softness of cotton clouds. He brought fresh bread from Clara's kitchen, still warm with the memory of careful kneading, and together they made sandwiches with the familiar rhythm that had once soothed his restless nights. "The circles keep growing," he said softly, his voice carrying the steady timbre of someone who had found his own calm center. The teenagers at the park, they're teaching younger kids now. Your gift has its own heartbeat. Elena appeared next, her wind chime laughter now carrying the deep music of someone who had learned to weather all her own storms with grace. She brought a paper crane folded from sheet music, its wings inscribed with a single word: presence. As she placed it gently in Iris's palm, her eyes held the warmth of shared understanding. "Thank you for teaching me that peace isn't about fixing things," she whispered, "but about learning to hold space for whatever needs to be held." The afternoon light slanted through their windows with unusual warmth, and at exactly 3:17, something extraordinary happened. The house didn't just experience its familiar gentle pause, it bowed, settling into the deepest quiet it had ever known. Throughout Millhaven, the moment expanded like ripples on a still pond. In the library's quiet nook, Mrs. Patterson felt her breath deepen without knowing why. At the lighthouse, Thomas paused in his daily tending and touched the lens housing with unusual tenderness. Every clock in town leaned back slightly, not stopping but offering a gesture of profound respect. Children in classrooms hummed 2 notes and left the third as breath, their voices joining in an unplanned chorus of gratitude. As evening approached, the family gathered without anyone having called them, drawn by love's own gravitational pull. Clara brought soup that steamed like small prayers rising, and Evan's weathered hand still carried sawdust under the nails as he placed a final wooden heart beside Iris's collection. The room filled with the comfortable weight of people who had learned to sit together in any weather, their presence creating the kind of sanctuary where important transitions could unfold with dignity and grace. At 9:17, the evening echo of their daily rhythm, Iris felt the familiar pull of expansion, but this time it was not her gift flowing outward, but her very essence preparing to join something larger. She understood now that she had never truly owned the peace she carried. She had simply been its custodian, its temporary vessel, learning to pour it freely into a world that desperately needed to remember what calm felt like. Her gift would continue flowing through all the hearts she had touched, all the hands she had taught to work with gentleness, all the souls who had learned to create sanctuary wherever they went. She hummed her 3 notes one final time, but instead of leaving the third as breath, she let it continue, rising and expanding until it seemed to fill not just the room but the entire night sky, a gentle benediction that touched every corner of the town she had loved into greater kindness. Her last breath carried the same quality as her first, a gentle sigh that seemed to bless everything it touched, releasing into the world all the peace she had gathered over a lifetime of patient tending. The clocks throughout Millhaven did not stop as they had on the night of her birth, but they paused in recognition, their hands moving forward with courteous acknowledgement of a life that had taught an entire community the art of peaceful presence. In that moment of collective stillness, everyone understood that they had witnessed not an ending, but a transformation, not a departure, but a return to the source from which all peace flows. In the days that followed, the workshops continued, led now by Eleanor and Sam and all the others who had learned to tend their own lights. The 3:17 pause remained a cherished rhythm, children learning it alongside their ABCs, understanding that some lessons are too precious to be forgotten. David continued crafting furniture that held her gentle wisdom in its very grain, each piece carrying the memory of 17 strokes and 3 quiet breaths, the soft twist that released whatever needed releasing. At the lighthouse, Thomas added a small brass plaque beside the great lens. For Iris, who taught us that light calls to light. The beacon continued its patient turning, steady and unafraid, its beam reaching across dark water to guide travelers safely home. And in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between one wave and the next, in the gentle settling that happens when day surrenders to night, she remained, not gone but transformed, not absent, but woven into the very fabric of peace itself. The town of Millhaven had learned that some gifts are too large to be contained by a single lifetime. In every star-shaped sandwich shared between friends, in every quiet corner where healing bloomed, in every 17 strokes of patience and 3 quiet breaths that punctuated difficult days, Iris continued her work. She had taught them that peace was not a destination, but a way of traveling, not a feeling but a practice that could transform the most ordinary moments into something sacred. And somewhere, In the space between waking and dreaming, she's still there, gathering quiet and giving it freely to a world that will always need more light. Steady as a lighthouse beam, soft as a cotton cloud in a child's palm, infinite as the kindness that keeps choosing us, one peaceful moment at a time. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay.